Well, good morning, everyone. Last week we started a new series. We're calling it Your Beautiful Struggle. And we talked a bit about different kinds of struggles in life and how ultimately our struggles often cause us to grow in our faith. They are part of something everyone goes through, and in the end we realize what we're really struggling with is all the sin and the darkness and the evil in this world, and that battle has already been won. And one of the things that I talked about last week was my days back when I was a kid, and we were really into the sport of wrestling, and I figure that some of you might not believe me. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. So I brought some proof. I've got a picture. What do you think about that? Yeah. Back in the day, started when I was 8 years old. I was in the 48-pound weight class, which Macon is already in that weight class, and he's only 4. So, But, it was a big part of life, something I enjoyed. I did all the way up through. Just so you don't think I stole someone's medal and posed that way, I've got another picture in action right there. You see that? Linda says it looks like my son. And I showed that picture to Macon, and he asked me who the other boy was, and I was like, I don't know. Yeah, this is my lifelong friend. We hang out all the time. No. But I wanted you to see that, in the passage we did, the word struggle is actually the word for wrestling. So it makes sense to see that battle, that struggle we have with sin and evil in this world. Now that we got the proof part over with, we'll move on. But I wanted you to see that those were true stories. Struggle is a part of life. But as we get into today, I want to mention that struggle is also something that we learn from. I don't know about you, but usually in our hardest times in life, in those seasons, God often teaches us the most. The worst struggle I ever had in life was in my days in college, particularly in grad school. And that was when I was kind of at my deepest, lowest point in life. And it was in that season that I think I grew the most in my faith, that I grew to understand who God had made me to be, that I finally came to accept my calling into the ministry. It was that season in which I struggled the most that God taught me the most. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of people. It is in our profound struggles that we often learn the most from God. And I think if we went around this room and we took testimonies, I think we would find that in large part to be true. It's when things are hard that we learn the most. And today I want to kind of dive into the story of someone who had it, I think, harder than any of us. A guy whose name is synonymous with struggle. And it's a biblical character, a person by the name of Job. And if you're familiar with Job's story is nothing but struggle. It starts out free and easy. His life is such that he's considered one of the most righteous people of his time. He follows God. He's got a whole bunch of kids and a large family, and he's gained a lot of wealth, and he's just doing fantastic. And Job has all this going on until suddenly the Satan steps in. And there's this meeting in heaven, and Satan basically accuses Job before God, and he says, now you know that Job wouldn't be this righteous person if he didn't have all these good things going for him in life. And God says, well, I don't believe that's the case. And they ended up working it out, and God allows, and that's an important point, God allows Satan to sort of challenge and test Job and put him through a struggle. And that sets the scene for the rest of the book. Job loses his children, unfortunately. He loses all of his wealth. He loses his own health of his body. He breaks out in sores, and he's broken, and he's hurting, and he's at death's door, really. And in all that time, he doesn't exactly take it lying down, but he never curses God. He never abandons God. He questions, he has ideas and thoughts, and that's really what the book is his friends come and they basically accuse him of having done some sin to lead him to this struggle. And he says, I haven't. And it goes on for 40-some chapters, poetically talking about God's fairness and what we do in our times of struggle. And Job, as this figurehead of struggle, I think represents something. And because of that, I think there's something to be learned from his life about how God teaches us through struggle. And I'm going to do my best to pull just a few thoughts in. There are more points we could make, but I'm going to try to pull in a couple from the life and story of Job. So we're going to actually start near the end, because I think this is the simplest and easiest and foremost lesson that all of us take from any struggle. Job chapter 41, and we'll start in verse 1 just to give some context, and then we'll jump down a little bit. In Job 41, God is finally answering Job back. And we're going to get into kind of how that happens, and it's into this storm, and it's really brilliant and fascinating. But there's a rather small point here that I think is important. God is basically telling Job, get all my J's together. He's telling Job, look, I know you think that you have the right to ask all these questions, but remember who you're talking to. And as such, God points out his power and his majesty and his ability to control all things. And as part of that, he mentions something called Leviathan. Now, there's a lot of speculation out there that people make as to what Leviathan is. And I'm going to tell you this deep insight. I don't care. Okay? Is Leviathan a souped-up poetic description of a crocodile? Maybe. Is he a creature that's extinct that we don't even know about necessarily? Maybe. Is he something from the stories that they read one another as kids, sort of this mythical creature? I don't know. But the point of the passage is Leviathan is really big and really powerful. And so God, in emphasizing his power to Job, says this: can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? In other words, are you that powerful, Job, that you could do this very thing? Remember, I created this. And then we jump down to verse 7. And he continues to go on after sort of mocking Job's powerlessness. And he says this: can you fill its head with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? No. If you lay a hand on it, Job, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. This is the simplest thing that we all take from our struggles. We learn, don't do that again. How many of you have ever learned a lesson the hard way? Yeah, don't do that again. That's the number one easiest thing you learn from a struggle. This is the person who puts their hand on the hot stove. This is the person that, tries to get out of an electrified fence. This is the person who thinks that they can buy their wife a pie tin for her birthday. And remembers, don't do that again. That was dumb. Unfortunately, we all have a tendency to have to learn certain things this way. And there's something that I think that God uses our mistakes to teach us not to do that again. And yes, in the case of Job, he's speaking poetically, but he's talking about you take on a monster, you will learn your lesson not to do that again. And I know I wish I could come up with a really funny story of me learning some lesson the hard way, but I struggle to come up with an exact one. But after church today, you go to lunch. I want you guys to share your own stories of learning lessons the hard way, okay? Because I bet you'll have a pretty fun time with it. But what I will add to this is that sometimes we learn from our lessons, sometimes we don't. There are people who continue to bang their head against the wall and never seem to learn not to do that. Or maybe we're just stubborn and keep doing it. There was a preacher up in Atlanta that many of you know by the name of Andy Stanley, and he did say this once that I thought was rather profound. He said, a lot of people think that experience makes you wiser. He says that's not entirely true. He says what is true is examined experience makes you wiser. That means just because you've made mistakes doesn't mean you won't make those mistakes again. But if when you make those mistakes, you stop and you examine, you think about how you got here and you understand the mistakes you made, then you become wiser. Then you stop trying to grapple with Leviathan. Then you learn from those mistakes and you become just a little bit smarter in God. Does that make sense? The easiest way to learn from your struggle is the very simple, don't do that again lesson. That one matters. But let's get into some more spiritual ones. The second lesson you can take from this. Number 2 is accepting God's will and uncontrollable outcomes. Now this is hard, and this really goes to the life of Job tremendously. Because Job has done everything right in life. He didn't make a huge mistake, you know. He tried to do all the right things, but because of these circumstances that he cannot control, he is now in an unfortunate situation. And this conversation throughout the book happens in rather profound ways. So, for instance, if we were to go back to, I told you we're going to mention when God responds to these 40 chapters of sort of speculation about the nature of God and His fairness. That happens in chapter 40. If you're following along, it's Job chapter 40, and we'll just begin with the first verses 6 and 7. Now, Job and his friends have been discussing the nature of God all this time, and it's time now for God to come in and sort of break up the conversation and to implement His words. And He does it in a rather frightening way through a storm that gathers around the friends in the moment. Verse 6, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. And I want you to hear this. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. This is God speaking to Job. Now, I'm sure at that moment, Job remembered that he was not the all-powerful in the universe. And you think about the dark storm swirling around you and the voice of God coming out of the storm saying, brace yourself. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Reminding him that it wasn't wrong for Job to question him. It was just really important to remember the fine line he was walking. That the person he was questioning was the God of the universe who had power over everything. And so God goes on these next couple of chapters talking about Leviathan and creation and all the things that God knows and takes care of and is over, how powerful He is. And this leads to Job's response in chapter 42, verses 1 through 3. Job, having listened to God's soliloquy, which, by the way, didn't entirely answer his complaint. Chapter 42, then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And he goes on and he repents. Job didn't do wrong by asking questions, but it was a fine line. And what mattered more was that God needed to simply say, "This is who I am," and that should be enough. Sometimes when we go through hard things we can't understand, we may never get the full explanation. Sometimes God forgoes giving us all the answers here in this life to understand why things happened the way that they did. Sometimes the things we are battling and fighting are fully outside of our control, and the only one who can control Leviathan is the God who made him. The only one who can step into your life and stop what's happening is the God who allowed it to happen. And the only one you can learn to put your faith and your trust in is Him. And sometimes what we have to realize is that what is outside of our control, we can only accept as within His control. The things that we can no longer fight because we don't have the strength or the energy or the ability to stand in front of all creation and manipulate its every moment. We have to trust God, and this becomes this challenge of faith. You see, what Satan did or the serpent did, we believe was Satan speaking to Adam and Eve, is he made them question God's motives. He said to him, God doesn't want you to eat from this fruit because then you will know the difference between right and wrong, and then you would be like what? God. You see, it's God's motive. See, God is harming you. God doesn't have your best interest in mind. And that little bit of faith and that little bit of trust gets undermined in that moment when we believe that lie. But when we believe that all these things outside of our control are in the hands of a God who has our best interest at mind, then our faith gets stretched and we learn something. We learn about our faith. We learn that the God of the universe is over it all. We are stretched to trust in Him. In the end, Job is fully restored. I don't know if you remember that point, but you get to the last part of it, and Job gets all of his crops and his animals and his wealth back double. He has another family and has just as big a family as he had before, even more so. All of his righteousness is rewarded in this life, and in our case, we have to believe the next. Going through hard times will cause you to either run away from your faith or lean into it all the harder. It's a weird thing, but it's true. You've known people who've gone through a hard time and they lost their faith. And you know other people who've gone through a hard time and became closer to God than they ever have been. Those people learned from their struggle. They grew in their faith. And they came to know the God of the universe does have their best interest in mind, even when they can't understand it. Job is confronted with this. He's not given a perfect answer, and many of us won't be either. But what we are called to do is learn from our struggle and grow closer to God in the process. I mentioned briefly that my biggest struggle, and I realize I'm still young and I have struggles that I'm probably going to go through someday beyond me. Stories that those of you who have been around a little longer could tell me about. But my biggest struggle was in school, trying to figure out what I was going to be and who I was going to be, and I fell into depression, and I stopped taking care of myself, and the doctors told me I couldn't go back to school. And it was in that season that I grew to trust God the most. And it was that time that made me, I believe, the minister that I can be now. And I don't think anything would be the same had I not walked through that struggle. And in the end, I came to trust that God had my best interest in mind. Because honestly, the whole thing was largely a lack of trust. I didn't trust that my life was going to turn out okay. And then I was challenged to trust God. These are not easy lessons, but they're important ones. And I would challenge you that in our struggles, we are to learn something. One was, don't do that again. But two was more spiritual. It's accepting God's will in uncontrollable outcomes. What we cannot control, we have to trust, or it will just drive us crazy. And number three, and I think this is rather profound, and it comes from a section in Job that you wouldn't have expected. But it's that in our struggle we find gratitude for a Savior. And after I read the passage, I think that will make sense. But if you'll go back now to early in Job when he's still sort of speculating things, Job chapter 9. Job sort of stumbles into something he could not have known. And it's rather fascinating. Job chapter 9, I'm just going to begin in verse 29. Job is talking and speculating on everything that's happened to him, and he says something odd. He says, "Since I am already found guilty," this seems to be either in the eyes of God or certainly in the eyes of his friends. "Since I am already found guilty, why should I struggle in vain? Why should I argue? Why should I fight this, Since I am already found guilty, why should I struggle in vain? Even if I washed myself with soap and my hands with cleansing powder, you," assumingly God, "would plunge me into a slime pit so that even my clothes would detest me." In other words, he's doubting God's goodwill for him. Let's put it that way. But then he stumbles into something. "He," that is God, "is not a mere mortal like me that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court." In other words, I can question God, but who am I to question him? There's no way for us to really settle this dispute between us, between me and God. If only, verse 33, if only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together. Who does that sound like? Someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. If this someone, this mediator between God and man actually existed, then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. Okay. Pay attention to this. Job stumbles onto something in his discussion about right and wrong. And that is, for us to take on God and challenge him with our struggles is untenable. He is so much bigger than us, so much more powerful than us. He knows everything. And the only way to make peace between God and human beings and to mutually understand their struggle is if there were to be some mediator. Someone who could stand in the gap between human beings and make it so that God could understand us. And Job, thousands of years before it ever happened, seems to hint upon the idea of a Savior that could come from heaven down to earth to mediate between God and human beings. It is in this moment he expresses the need that all of us have for Jesus. For someone who went through the struggles of being human while also knowing the mind of God. Someone who could stand in heaven and sort of work on our behalf. who could explain to God what it's like to be a human being and know that God understood. Then we would be able to converse with God through our struggles. Then, and only then, could peace be made. And how amazing it is that God provided a way. The writer of Hebrews seems to catch on to this very need, and he talks about it in profound ways. And so you jump over to Hebrews chapter 4, and there's this famous passage which is talking about the role Jesus plays. And he describes him in their own cultural terms as a high priest, which means someone who speaks to God on your behalf. Only Jesus is a different kind of high priest, and he explains it this way. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, this is Jesus, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness. What does that mean? We don't have a God or a mediator who can't understand what we go through. Because in fact, he does. He was incarnate. He was made to live on earth like us. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. That tempted means for sin, but it also means trouble, tribulation, trials, struggles. That's the breadth of the Greek word there. Not just tempted to sin, but struggled like we did, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. Keeping going. And the conclusion of that is, let us then approach God's throne of grace with, and what's that word? Confidence. Confidence. So that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of struggle or need. Whatever you're going through, the brilliant and amazing piece of the gospel is that we have a high priest who understands. And because of that, this perfect high priest who paid the price for all things and who mediates between us and God, we can go directly to God with our struggles, with our trials, with our hurt, with our pain, and God will help us because he understands what we've gone through, because he can speak into our quiet places and comfort our hurting hearts, because he can bring confidence to those who have lost it, peace to those who are tossed about, and freedom from those who have been tied down to all the things happening around them. Struggle is something we learn from. If we did something dumb, we learn don't do that again. If we are involved in something we cannot control, we learn to trust God with the outcomes of the things we cannot control. And if we struggle, we learn that God understands, and we learn to go to him. All of this stretching our faith, all of this drawing us closer to him, all of this making us into the people he called us to be. After all, Jesus himself struggled on earth with human beings and trials and hardships and pain and even suffering. Why should we think it would be different for us? The most important piece is that because he went through that, he understands what we're going through. And because of that, he is our comfort, our help, our strength, and our peace. Struggles are things that we learn from. They draw us closer to him. To give one little personal story to top it off, I remember after I got out of school, and I was more than ever sort of convinced of my call to the ministry, and God opened up this door at my home church that I grew up in, and I got a chance to sort of go there and sort of do a little bit of ministry. There was a new service they were starting for young adults, and I was trying my best to sort of be like a the campus pastor, even though it was a small little church and there were only, 30 people in this service, but it was my chance to sort of learn ministry. And pretty quickly, the senior minister got let go, and the youth minister got let go, and all of a sudden, I was like the second most senior person on staff. And I started preaching every week, and for 8 months, I preached every week, just out of school. And it was very frightening. I learned a lot, but it was very challenging. There was also a lot of turmoil in the church. I mean, obviously, you let go 2 major staff people all at once. There's something going on. And I remember when they finally kind of got it resolved and brought another guy in, the only thing they could offer me was to stay on staff at internship pay as the full-time youth minister. And I thought about taking that. But after preaching 8 months and realizing that I was not going to be a youth minister, in fact, I would be terrible at it, I had to take a leap of faith. And I had to turn it down, and I had to look for something else. And I'm not saying that was, the kind of leap of faith that some people go through, but for me, that was a leap of faith. And by the grace of God, that's how I ended up in Kansas and how I ended up back here one day. And I just know that without that season of struggle, I don't think I would have known how much I loved the ministry, even when it was hard. And I would not have been where I am without having gone through it. There are other times I struggled in life, and I'm not sure I learned what I should have learned. But that time, I think I did. And I would just challenge you to learn from your struggles. Your struggle is beautiful. It's part of life. It's something everyone goes through. And I think God intends to teach us in them. So don't waste your struggle. Learn from it. Let God take you to somewhere you've never been before, because in that moment, you are more focused on what He is doing than any other time, because you are desperately dependent on Him. Learn from your struggles and don't waste them. A couple of quick application points. These kind of go through with our different kinds of lessons, but number one, when you've made bad decisions and you're struggling because of those bad decisions, examine them and how you got there and learn from them. Learn that there are sometimes we overreact to things or we do things in the wrong way, and we need to learn to be more self-controlled or to do things in a different way. Number two, learn to trust God, especially when you can't control the outcome. There are always going to be things we are not in charge of, and that should actually bring you peace, because that means God is in charge of it, and He is all-powerful, and He has our best interest at mind. Not necessarily meaning He's going to make life easy here on earth, but in the end, He has the best in mind for our soul, for the destination of where we are going, and for our relationship with Him. And number three, remind yourself that God does in fact understand what you are going through. He Himself sent His Son who struggled and mediates on your behalf. And because of that, we can be grateful for Jesus. Job did not have that benefit. He could only speculate, what if someone like that existed? But we have that Jesus. And that gives us the power to go to God because we know that He gets us. And so I'd urge you to say a prayer of gratitude for what we have and go directly to God because He understands. That's everything I've got today. We'll continue with this series next week. I do believe that struggle is very real, and I just pray that it's something we learn from. If you will, bow your heads. God, I don't enjoy struggle, and I hope that no one in here thinks that I take that lightly or that I'm being glib about it, because struggles are unbelievable in the way that they break us down. There's something I don't wish anyone to go through. But I do know that they seem to be part of life, and they seem to be part of the tools that you use to teach us. And so I pray that anyone here who's going through a struggle, that struggle won't be wasted. I pray, Lord, that you'll teach them in it, help them through it. And I thank you, God, so much. I thank you that you sent us your Son. I thank you that because of him, we have this tangible evidence that you understand, that you get us, that you're not this faraway God who invented the world and then stepped away. You are a God who feels every teardrop, who sees every snotty nose and desperate prayer, who feels in his heart what it's like to lose something he loves. And because of that, is determined to show mercy to his followers. God, let us feel in these moments that you are here with us, because according to your word, you are. Thank you for loving us that personally, that individually, and with that much realness. God, you are great, and we thank you and love you. Amen.